Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dissenter Weekly Update. I'm Kevin Gostola, the managing editor for Shadowproof.com. This is your show for March 19th, 2020. Around the world, the vast majority of people are quarantining and taking precautions in some manner to decrease the spread of COVID-19 or the coronavirus. It's coronavirus 24/7, and it's rather overwhelming for all of us emotionally. But we are relieved. We're relieved that we are still able to broadcast to you and do our show. And I'm here with Brian Sonnenstein, and he has some housekeeping items for you.
Yeah, before we start, please hit subscribe so that you get updates from our show and follow along. We'll be doing this every week as we have been for the last few months. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Shadowproof.com. And if you're able to, I know a lot of people have lost work and so on and so forth, but if you're able to, please consider supporting us by donating at shadowproof.com/donate. We're 100% reader funded, and now it's more important than ever to support independent media and make sure that we have journalists we can depend on to get out the news. So with that, Kevin, I think we should just turn to our first story here regarding homeless people blowing the whistle on inhumane conditions that will spread the coronavirus. Can you talk a little bit about this? Start us off.
Yeah, and I think I just want to make a general point here about some of these stories we're going to see throughout the country during this outbreak. One thing you can do is look for people who are talking to the press anonymously. We're going to have a lot of vulnerable people who are speaking out, whether they're in their workplace, working for government institutions, or people who are in prisons who are worried about being retaliated against by staff, the warden, what have you. And so that's also true for these homeless shelters. I found this. I could cover a lot of different stories this week on the coronavirus outbreak, and we have several for this week. But this one in particular I wanted to highlight because you have an individual, a homeless man in his 70s, who is living at a Santa Ana shelter in Orange County in California, and bringing some specifics to the forefront about what's happening at overcrowded homeless shelters, something that is not in the rotation of stories in the coverage that you're seeing on CNN or MSNBC about this outbreak and a critical issue that needs attention. And this person spoke to The Guardian anonymously and said, "If I start coughing, they may throw me out and I will have no place to go." The resident has been at this facility for multiple years and said, "If I catch it and die, this miserable life will be over for me." He has problems, but in the bleakness, it kind of seems like he's thinking, at least everything that he's gone through might end. So it's really bleak, that sort of a comment. His shelter, a former bus terminal that houses more than 400 people in cots, has multiple broken sinks and dysfunctional soap dispensers. The man said, "We have to supply our own soap, and then we have to wait in line to get a sink that works." So this is probably something that these shelters were dealing with before the coronavirus outbreak. Like a lot of things we've seen, the outbreak put a stress on already malfunctioning, dysfunctional, and inhumane settings that exist throughout this country and around the world. And residents have reported that there are empty soap dispensers, there's a lack of toilet paper, no hot water, broken sinks, no working thermometers, blood-stained walls, and infrequent cleaning. And these shelters, they're not prepared to cope with what's going to happen as the virus intensifies. We could imagine people losing their homes, layoffs. As of right now, we've seen throughout the country moratoriums on evictions. What happens if that moratorium ends and people are still struggling with the impact of this coronavirus? Those shelters are going to have a lot of stress, and we're going to need to listen to more of these people who warn us of what's going on at these shelters.
Thank you, Kevin. And if I could just, quickly add a few thoughts on that as well. I was really glad that you pulled out this story here. To your point that a lot of these, the crises that we're seeing now were pre-existing. A lot of these shelters are very crowded. There are a lot of people, a lot of them have sort of multiple cots in a small confined area in a room. How do you social distance, especially considering what we know about how you can be contagious with coronavirus for 2 weeks before showing symptoms. A lot of these shelters throw people out really early in the morning, and they don't let them back in until the evening. How do you stay healthy during that time? If you're not feeling well and then you get thrown out onto the street, where do you go? A lot of the recommendations that we've been seeing from doctors and medical professionals right now are encouraging people, to the extent that they can, to boost their immune systems by eating healthy, by getting exercise, so on and so forth. It's virtually impossible to do that in a setting like this, or in the context of being homeless. So I do think that this, similar to what we'll see in jails and prisons and a lot of other, similar situations, I think this is going to be a big issue. And just the final point I want to make is in terms of the relief that's being provided. I'm seeing a lot of people begin to wonder openly, well, if they're going to send checks to everybody, if they're going to direct deposit, relief checks to people, how do the homeless get those? They don't have homes, they don't have mailboxes, they don't have bank accounts. And so I think, again, going back to your point, I think we're seeing here laid very plain that we don't have a society or the delivery systems in order that to make a lot of this happen. And so, again, I was really glad that you brought this up. And I don't know if you have anything you wanted to say back to that, or if we wanted to move on to the next story.
We can go on to the next story.
Cool. Thank you. All right. The next story we have here is from the Justice Department. They're urged to set up a coronavirus false claims task force to deal with fraud stemming from the coronavirus crisis. What's going on here?
Yeah, this is a recommendation from the National Whistleblower Center, and they're suggesting that the Justice Department be proactive in following and tracking federal programs. There's all these aid programs, assistance programs, different initiatives being set up in order to deal with this coronavirus outbreak. But I think because you're going to be recruiting corporations, businesses, or even just individual players, you have to be aware that there's going to probably be an amount of fraud involved in the way these federal programs are managed. For example, they want False Claims Act to be able to be used in order to go after this corruption. And primarily that would be the way to have this task force operate and hold individuals and these businesses, I suppose, accountable. This has been used before. It's quite common. We've seen stealing from disaster sites. We've seen the selling of defective body armor to police. We've seen deficient health care provided under Medicaid. And one way you can go after people for being responsible for this is to use the False Claims Act. The Justice Department actually announced back on March 3rd that there would be a national nursing home initiative. And if you think about where we were in the timeline with the coronavirus outbreak, there was this horrible story in Washington State about the nursing home that had the virus spread. Dozens of people were affected by it. So the government was encouraged to, or by setting up this initiative, they were going to be looking at nursing homes and their failures to protect residents, whether that meant failing to provide adequate staff, could be substandard hygiene and infection controls, could be inadequate nutrition, could be the improper use of physical or chemical restraints, maybe refusing to provide pain medication, inadequate facility cleanliness, whatever it might be that might put at risk the health of people in nursing homes. That was something that the Justice Department was willing to look into. And so this whistleblower center just says, let's go broadly. Let's go even more broadly. Let's have a quick response to any fraud that might impact patient care. Let's look at any claims that might come forward from the use of these programs. Let's make sure that the Justice Department is prioritizing any coronavirus-related cases that have merits under the False Claims Act. And let's make sure that we're keeping everything as legitimate as possible so that people get the money they deserve, people get the services that they need, and that there aren't individuals who are able to get away with profiting off this crisis.
Thank you, Kevin. Our next story involves the whistleblower in China that we've heard a bit about over the last few days and weeks. We have Chinese investigators recommended punishment for officials who retaliated against the coronavirus whistleblower. Run through this for us.
Yeah, so we typically have had a standard here on the show of not covering stories that are going to get widespread attention in the mainstream news media. I think I want to talk about this just to make a point that may not be made in a lot of the establishment news coverage, because I obviously agree that it's horrific that this whistleblower was retaliated against. His name is Li Wenlang, and he was he was one of the 8 doctors who was reprimanded by Chinese police. He was forced to sign a letter that said that he had made false comments about the coronavirus, and he ended up dying from it in early February. And the point that I want to make is that when we look at our country, when we look at whistleblower cases, and expand it to being world, what we rarely see are authorities coming clean so quickly around what happened. And the authorities in Beijing have conducted an investigation, and they determined that he actually did not deserve to face this kind of retaliation from local law enforcement in Wuhan. Of course, Wuhan is where this virus is said to have originated. And they recommended that the officers who were involved in reprimanding Li be punished. The state media in China reported that the Wuhan Police Department has issued a formal apology to the doctor's family. And so in this particular story, in this particular matter related to this whistleblower who faced retaliation, you see the government of China is actually, it appears, getting it right. And I would just say that I think one, that probably has to do with the worldwide attention to the coronavirus outbreak right now. But then also I'll make another point just to say that, like, rarely do you see this kind of movement. I mean, think of the United States, think of these cases under the Espionage Act, think of some of the more federal whistleblowers who have taken risks and put their lives on the line, and at risk to their health as well. And they very rarely get any sorts of backing up from the federal government. You don't usually see anyone in the federal government coming to their side or coming to their family's side if they are no longer living. So I kind of wanted to offer a dissenting viewpoint just to say that I think most people are like, yeah, this shows that shame on China for not taking the virus seriously. This continues to feed into a lot of racist notions about China and the way that they handled the virus. But I think every single country has had its own failures. And at least what you can say about this is they recognize that they were wrong collectively to have allowed the retaliation against this whistleblower to go on. And I will note that if he's one of 8 doctors who was reprimanded, we should pay attention going forward to whether these other 7 doctors, I don't know that all of them became severely ill. I don't think they all died. So we should be mindful of, going forward, what are they going to do to make it right for those people as well?
Thank you. Our next story, this is something that you've covered over the years, definitely going back to when we first started Shadowproof and maybe even before. And I've been really grateful for your coverage. We have a story here about groups appealing to ag-gag law in Arkansas that silences whistleblowers who expose factory farm abuses. Can you tell people what ag-gag laws are and also walk them through, what's happening here in Arkansas?
Yeah, but let me just preface and say this came on March 12th. It's like right when this was all escalating and everything was shutting down. It's unfortunate that these groups, as they filed this appeal, didn't get any coverage because this is a crucial appeal to file in defense of journalism and in defense of activists, as well as in defense of whistleblowers who are seeking to expose the kind of animal cruelty as well as factory farm abuses that go on in agribusinesses, by agribusinesses. And so when we're talking about an ag-gag law, what we're talking about is a law that very specifically undermines and violates the First Amendment. They've been ruled unconstitutional in various states. They've been found to be so strict and unfair in the sense that they do not, basically in Arkansas, we're talking about this law here in Arkansas. So that was enacted in 2017. And what it basically enables agricultural businesses to do is sue whistleblowers who expose the cruel conditions that animals endure in the factory farms. It bans undercover investigations of virtually all private entities, according to these groups. And that includes nursing homes as well as daycare centers. So, like essentially there's a way that the law was written that other private businesses could exploit even if they are not involved in the food business. So whistleblowers can be liable for tens of thousands of dollars just for exposing the truth, is what these groups argue. You have Animal Equality, the Animal Legal Defense Fund, the Center for Biological Diversity, and Food Chain Workers Alliance being the main groups that have been at the forefront of fighting these kinds of laws. Attorney with Animal Equality, her name is Sarah Hannikin, said, quote, "Every investigation we conduct provides new critical insights into the realities of animal agriculture, an industry rife with issues of public concern. Without these insights, we are severely limited in our ability to effectively advocate for the interests of vulnerable individuals behind opaque industry walls." And again, I just emphasize that you've seen these cases won state by state. It's been almost uniformly acknowledged by lower courts that these are unconstitutional. It's a little surprising to me that it made it to an appeal stage in the Arkansas state, and what that means is that they lost in the district court, and then it was on them to appeal. Normally, it's been the agribusinesses themselves and then their lobby groups or whatever that are appealing because they don't like that they have lost in the courts. So for it to be the other way around is a bit shocking to me in Arkansas.
Thank you. Our next story is out of Australia. We have Australian Special Forces whistleblower reveals murders of Afghans in the war. What's happening in this story?
Yeah, so just to remind everyone, we still have the Afghanistan war going to some degree, whether President Trump and the Taliban were able to negotiate some kind of an agreement. And stunningly, even after they were negotiating some kind of a peace deal, there were still attacks going on with bombs being dropped. It seemed like hostilities were actually escalating after the peace deal, which is the opposite of what someone might expect. And so Four Corners in Australia did a documentary. They put it out in the last, they put it out on March 16th, and they interviewed a special forces soldier from Australia who was involved in the war, who witnessed the murder of Afghans. This is back in 2012. He witnessed 3 incidents, and he himself said you can't shoot unarmed people and not call that murder. This veteran believes that these individuals should be brought up on war crimes. There was a local imam and his son who were killed by Australian soldiers in a raid on the village of Sola back in 2012. And if you go to abc.net, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which does this, you can find a short documentary. We can share it with Shadowproof account, something that we're capable of doing. It's called Killing Field. If this is something that is of interest to you. But I just thought, the war crimes that have gone on in Afghanistan don't usually get the attention that's deserved. This is one of those other stories where it's just going to fall through the cracks. Definitely less attention because we're all dealing with the coronavirus. And I think actually Australia was a bit behind us in terms of where they are with the pandemic. So they're just now seeing it accelerate. They're just now shutting down society. And so obviously in the last day or two, you can't expect Australians to care too much about this story. So I wanted to highlight it because I think it's an important piece of journalism looking at clear war crimes in Afghanistan. And again, the people who were killed was a son and his father, who was a local imam. They were villagers, villagers who led night prayers at a Sola mosque. Say that the Australians arrived and they were kicked in the head. They were abused. this was retaliation because an Afghan soldier apparently who went rogue had killed Australian troops. There was a mission to find the rogue soldier. They were rounding up people. They were putting coverings over their heads and binding their hands. And then they were engaging in all manner of abuses and also murdering people. So this is an important story. This definitely amounts to war crimes.
Thank you, Kevin. Let's turn to the next section of the show where we give updates on Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning, and others. We've been following what doctors have been saying, advocating on Assange's behalf and the conditions that he's facing at Belmarsh Prison. You have here the doctors are demanding Assange's release at Belmarsh as it becomes a breeding ground for coronavirus. What's going on here?
Yeah, the Prison Governors Association has warned that he says, fertile breeding grounds for the coronavirus is what prisons are, probably describing the UK. And so Julian Assange's life and health are at heightened risk due to his arbitrary detention during the global pandemic. That threat will only grow as the coronavirus spreads. The Doctors for Assange have made appeals once again. They've renewed them to the ministers in Australia to request that they do something to look after Julian's well-being. And his mother is out there advocating, getting people to sign a petition to say that he should be out on bail. He should not be in this facility at risk. So you're seeing many of these people who have their individual cases, their family members are engaged in these campaigns to put pressure on government officials to let them out, release them. I mean, even if it's temporary, what we saw in Iran, for example, 85,000 prisoners have been released because of the crisis that they're going through in dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. And some of those are political prisoners, and they can expect to be recarcerated after the pandemic. But essentially what Iran is doing is saying having them in prison is unhealthy and not something that we can guarantee that it's not going to fuel the spread of this disease. And so they let them out. And the same could be done for prisoners in the UK. It actually could be done in places all over the world, including the United States. And so they're taking this moment and highlighting what is happening. The UK Prisoners Advice Service has called for the release of prisoners, including those who are awaiting extradition. And one statement in this petition, in the update from the people who are fighting the extradition of Assange, is that Julian is a nonviolent gentleman of an intellectual nature who is at high risk of becoming seriously ill due to the coronavirus and must be released immediately. So they are doing all that they can to try and get him out of this Belmarsh facility where he is, and everyone else is as well, vulnerable to contracting the virus.
Thank you, Kevin. Our last story involves Chelsea Manning here. We know that she was facing, I think, a few $100,000 in fines from refusing to participate in the grand jury proceedings. And now we have some news that her supporters have helped her raise that money. Can you talk about this?
Yeah, this is an upbeat story. I think that we can all be proud and celebrate the show of solidarity that occurred. It's unfortunate that Judge Anthony Trenga was allowed to, and there simply was, especially in this time, no means, no guarantee that they would be able to go through with an appeal in the immediate. Although I guess I could say I'm not sure how aggressive the government would have been in trying to collect this fine in this environment. But she faced a $256,000 fine because she resisted the WikiLeaks grand jury and refused to testify. And we covered her release in the prior episode edition of Dissenter Weekly. And then 2 or 3 days later, they raised $266,000 for Chelsea. Not only did they bring in $10,000 extra dollars for her fine, but they were able to do it in 2 or 3 days. They really didn't even need all the time for this GoFundMe in order to raise the money. In fact, the organizer disabled new donations for the fundraiser. That's an amazing spot to be in if you're trying to help someone out. They were able to then move on to raising money for living expenses for Chelsea, and they asked for $30,000. And this was for getting her back on her feet. She didn't have a home when she left. She had all of her belongings in a storage facility for a year while she was in this jail in the adult detention center in Alexandria. She was not able to do anything for income. So they asked people to help out Chelsea, and they raised $54,000. They're still accepting donations over there. If you think Chelsea deserves any more, you can find it over at GoFundMe for her living expenses. But this is amazing. They raised over $300,000 for Chelsea in the span of about a week, and she is getting the kind of support that she deserves for taking a stand on her principles, for fighting for not only the right to not be under assault by this abusive grand jury, to not allow it to be used to target activists, but also to take a stand for press freedom, to stand on principle and say that using this grand jury for the purpose in which it was used is not something that we should stand for. So I'm glad for her. And if there's anything that we can be grateful for in this moment, it is that Chelsea Manning is not in jail while we are all dealing with this global pandemic. We usually have several cases that we highlight towards the end just to remind people of cases that we're following. And with this pandemic, a lot has shifted. We had talked about the potential of an upcoming trial with Daniel Hale, who's the alleged drone whistleblower. And as you can see from what we're all going through, it doesn't look like that trial is going to be happening at this moment. And it was actually scheduled for this week. And in fact, there's really no possibility or that it would happen in the immediate, because the courts are all shut down. Most of these cases are on hold. So we'll update you soon if we find out what's going to happen with his case. Reality Winner is a case that we've talked about. Her mother has been raising people's awareness in the same way that people have been raising awareness about Julian Assange. She's at FCI Carswell in Texas. They're serving a federal prison sentence right now. And they're very upset and distraught and afraid for Reality because of the fact that, well, for one, she's a nonviolent prisoner. She definitely fits the criteria of somebody who should not be in prison right now. She shouldn't have been in prison at all. Which is not to say that violent prisoners deserve to be vulnerable to the coronavirus either. But her family are really dealing with this crisis and concerned that she is going to get the disease like a lot of families in this country right now. So that's something to keep in mind. There are a couple other whistleblower cases. Well, there's Terry Albury, the FBI whistleblower, who is still, again, in prison in the same predicament, really, as Reality Winner. Again, concerned that people might get the virus. And just to be clear here, the thing with prisons, and Brian, you can chime in if you would like, but really the concern here with prisons is that you're going to have staff or guards, you're going to have the warden, you're going to have officials in these facilities coming in and out and bringing the virus into these prisons. There might be a few people coming in from jails, but there aren't a whole lot of cases being processed. There aren't really a lot of people being moved from jails anymore. That has kind of come to a screeching halt. So if the virus is going to spread in these facilities, the culprits are going to be the staff and the people who manage these facilities who are responsible. And, it tends to be that we don't actually give them the attention that they deserve for the crises that they create in these facilities. And so just keep in mind that these prisoners who we highlight, these cases that we highlight on a weekly basis right now at this moment, are vulnerable because of the failure of administrators to either commute their sentences or to do something to give them a kind of furlough. I mean, anyone could order that these prisoners be released to their homes and then bring them back into custody after this outbreak.
That's right. I mean, I think you covered it pretty well. I'll just, add that for federal prisoners, Donald Trump, stroke of a pen, could send any of them home. State prisoners, any one of these governors, stroke of a pen, can send, even if it was just the most vulnerable, the elderly, the sick, of which we have an enormous proportion in our prison systems. Stroke of a pen can send them home. You have really a recipe for catastrophe. We have an article up on Shadowproof that I encourage people to read with a lot of details. In addition to the crowding, a lot of county jails, for example, like Kevin was talking about, they don't have any medical staff. They might have one or two nurses. They'll have a doctor, especially in rural areas, a doctor who travels around to multiple jails and serves multiple jails over a 100-mile radius. We don't have access to nutrition for prisoners. Most of them have to survive eating commissary items. And finally, to your point, Kevin, it really will be prison staff who are putting prisoners in danger. Most prisons and jails have canceled visitation at this point. No visitors are coming in most places. And the idea that, we're going to put prisoners who are in this extremely high risk category by the very nature of their confinement in this position and keep sending staff into these facilities is just a monstrosity. So, like I said, we have an article at Shadowproof that goes through the various different aspects of this scenario for people in ICE detention centers and county jails and state prisons. There's wide latitude at the highest levels, enormous power of discretion for people, for governors and for the president to release people. And I really think that we should be putting enormous pressure on them to do that. We don't have to wait for judges. We don't have to have hearings. A lot of these governors have thousands of pardon and clemency applications on their desks right now. So there really is no excuse.
They have one from Reality. Reality
right.
Put in a formal request, so all it has to do is be signed off on. Yep. Donald Trump could do that. So as we close here, I just want to, as I do every week, thank you all for supporting the work that we do. We realize the stress that you're going through with your families and in your community. But for those of you who are able to continue your support of our organization and of this weekly show and are receiving our member newsletter as subscribers, for those of you who continue to pay attention to what we're doing and engage with our work, we really thank you. We know that everything is quite overwhelming, as we said at the top of the show, and a lot of people are struggling with whether what we're going through in this moment is going to be the worst case scenario, or maybe we're panicking too much and we need to calm down. And I think what you're seeing throughout is a lot of people are trying to find that equilibrium, find that balance where they can be able to exist in this outbreak. We're all isolated from each other. People are feeling like they're not connected. So to the extent that we can connect with each other, I think Shadowproof will try to do its best to try to engage with you. And we don't really want spam, but if any of you are going through anything and you think we would benefit from being able to engage with you, if you think showing solidarity is, if there's something we could do to step in, let's take a moment and just open up the editor account to you and say that you can write to us and let us know whether you're members or just readers or just someone who there's something you're going through in your workplace, or you have somebody who's in prison in your family, or there's something that you're seeing happen in your neighborhood that you're concerned about. Feel free to pass it on to us and we can talk with each other. And we have to support each other in this moment, because we're not going to see a resolution to the systemic problems come from our politicians. It's going to take the interest that we have in doing right by people to get this manageable, to keep this manageable, to help us all cope and make it through this crisis moment. So again, thank you for all of your support. Thank you for our work. Obviously, a lot of what we do is to some degree on hold. People who follow this show would expect that coming in May, we might be covering Julian Assange's hearing that was upcoming around his extradition. But we have no idea at this moment if that's going to be able to be held during this global pandemic, and it's likely to be rescheduled. There's so much about this year that has been thrown into a complete tumult, and so we all just need to be flexible, and we're happy to have you around in order to watch us on a weekly basis. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Just finally, I want to say, like I said at the top of the show, please subscribe on YouTube. Please follow us on social media. We'll be continuing to dig into coronavirus, particularly with regards to prisons and detention. As Kevin said, send us tips at editor at shadowproof.com. Drop us a message on Facebook or DM us on Twitter. However you want to reach out to us, we'd love to hear from you. Please stay safe and take care of each other out there, and we will talk to you soon.